My name's Joe Albert, and I'm late and embarrassed by that. Hi, Dawn. I'm very sorry about this.
Hi. If you stand
Where should I stand?
Well, in Italy, there's something called the academic quarter hour, so you're well within that.
yes, you can see you.
Like face this way? Is that good?
I can accommodate you wherever you want to go.
Well, no, don't tell me that.
I don't know if it matters, but you are right behind the little box that shows my face to me. So I can see from the neck down, you're kind of headless.
That's better, probably.
Okay,
Oh,
that's better for
okay.
me.
That's often better when I'm headless. Yeah.
It's disturbing to have a headless person come.
Yeah, that's what I did. So anyway, thanks for coming, everybody. I'm just going to do a really quick introduction. Caitlin Bala, who you've been interacting with a bit, is a rather remarkable graduate of Gonzaga from a couple of years ago, and just finishing her master's program right now in organizational leadership, and will be heading off to New Zealand this summer to do a year of study, and excited for her. She is one of the rare Gonzaga students that graduated both from the honors program that Father Tim Clancy runs, so I'll introduce just momentarily, a Hogan Entrepreneurial Program, and a Comprehensive Leadership Program, along with her regular four-year degree. So it's just an amazing achievement. So she is the collaborator with me on these roundtable events. For about the last year and a half, Caitlin and I have organized these events, and the idea was to bring various faculty members together from different disciplines, and even off-campus faculty members together, to bring their disciplines to bear on a question that we would think would be relevant and of interest to students, staff, and faculty. And so we began a year and a half ago with just narrative and authenticity, and faculty from philosophy, psychology, English, and other departments came together and really explored the intersect between those two concepts. Really popular, very effective, I thought, and very rich discussion. And all of this is sort of centered within this dialogic framework that I'm going to talk about in just a second. Tonight's program is going to feature three sort of key issues that we want to address. One is narrative, which is especially self-narratives, how we think about ourselves in terms of our identity from a narrative perspective. The second leg, and related to that, is this notion of social media. My exposure over the last couple of years has been with, especially with undergraduate students, this explosion of things like MySpace and MySpace, Facebook, things like that, and how people portray themselves, what narratives they use to sort of present themselves to friends, family, and others, and the general public. And also how organizations now are using these social media technologies to present themselves in the community. And that brings us to the third leg of this stool tonight, which is really authenticity. How authentic are these representations? If we assume maybe that being authentic is a worthy goal for both individuals and organizations, how might they be measured? And in just a moment, when I introduce Dawn, we're going to comment a little bit on an article that she had us read. We reread actually in preparation for tonight. So that's really the focus of tonight's discussion, this dialogue, is narrative authenticity and social media from both an individual and organizational perspective. Our panelists are here to be participants in a dialogue. Rather than a debate where we look for differences and look for flaws in each other's points of view, in a dialogic framework such as this, we're really exploring common ground, new possibilities. Last summer I was in Washington, D.C., and I was walking, I was doing some work there, and I was walking up the mall, and there was the Organization of American States building there. And it was really hot and humid in D.C., and so I went into the first air-conditioned building I could find, and that was it. And fortunately, I was actually the only person in that museum that day. But the exhibit was entitled The Architecture of Dialogue. And it was fascinating to me, so I went in and walked around, and it basically involved this architect that was commissioned to build this building, the Organization of American States building, and design it. And what he did internally was have a dialogue between North American culture, architecture, and Latin American culture and architecture. And he allowed that to play out and ultimately resulted in this architecture he created for this building. And it just fascinated me, that idea. And that's how I think about tonight, is allowing these different points of view, these different disciplines that are represented here by all these faculty members. What do they offer in terms of this intersect of narrative authenticity and social media? and what that might suggest for us down the road in terms of new possibilities. So what we're going to do, Dr. Gilbert will share a little bit here. I asked her as a special guest to offer some opening remarks. And then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to react a bit, and then we're just going to open it up for dialogue. And we'll see where that takes us. So let me introduce folks really quickly if I can. And my introductory notes are at home, so I'll do the best I can. I'm going to start with Dr. John Caputo. John and I have been colleagues for a number of years here at Gonzaga. He's a professor in the Communication Arts Department, founded the Master's Program in Communication and Leadership Studies, and also, I believe, founded the Northwest Alliance for Responsible Media. And that's a really key feature of his presence tonight, is offering the perspective on media. And how that might play out from this notion of narrative and authenticity. Sitting to his right is Dr. Heather Crandall. Heather is, we share a wall actually back to back in our offices. Heather is the director this year of the Communication and Leadership Program, has been the chair for the last couple of years actually, and is also involved with the Northwest Alliance for Responsible Media. Chris Morehouse, who was actually a member of our Story Slam, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, earlier this spring, is a lecturer in the communication arts and journalism, and also has a lot of interest in media, and excited to have her actually participate as a panelist here tonight. I'm going to start down at the other end now. Father Tim Clancy. Tim is director of the Honors Program, professor in the philosophy department, and also runs the Honors Program. An amazing collection of students that each year turns out these kids that go on. We're talking about one of our students tonight that we shared over the years, and she just got accepted, I think, to Yale Law, you know, and it's just an amazing group of kids that Tim leads every year, and it's just fun to be with him. Dr. Kirk Besmer, also a faculty member in the philosophy department. Both Tim and Kirk also have taught classes in the philosophy of technology, so it's really kind of fun to have them here. So, and Caitlin, I'll allow you to do the other introduction.
Oh, Miss Katie.
Yeah, no, I'm going to introduce Katie.
Yeah.
Katie is an amazing senior, and the reason that we asked her to be included in the dialogue was I asked Father Clancy which honors students would be able to speak eloquently on the topic of the philosophy of technology and social media, and he's like, Katie! So that's why you're here. She's also in the Hogan Entrepreneurial Leadership Program and is like an amazing Wonder Woman of many talents, and is extremely intelligent and eloquent. So thanks for joining us as our guest student panelist.
Yeah.
Would you like, I'll introduce Dawn unless you would like to, because you're the one that made the contact. Sure.
Yeah.
Special guest tonight, Dr. Dawn Gilpin, is a faculty member at the Walter Cronkite School of Mass Communication and Journalism. Is that correct?
It's the other way around. I would like it that way. Journalism and mass communication.
And who said politics aren't real in higher ed, you know? That's great. Her article, Socially Mediated Authenticity, was really helpful to me and thought-provoking. And she spent time in Italy, and I'll have her talk a bit about herself here and her interests. But I'm even going to throw a question to you and then let you ignore it if you like, and just sort of offer your opening comments. But one of the things Dawn did in the article, which I found really helpful, was begin to look at ways we might measure authenticity in terms of public presentations, in terms of an organization. And she offered 4 dimensions, and the 4 dimensions really I found very useful. And I'm wondering, Dawn, if those could also be transferred over to measures of authenticity in terms of individual representations as people sort of put them out there. So I'm just going to sort of turn it over to you, and you can feel free to engage or ignore the question and go with wherever you like. But thank you so much for being here tonight. We really appreciate
I'm
it.
excited. I am very honored to have been asked to take part in this, and I can't wait for the actual conversation to start. So I will try to be brief, but like most academics, I always have a lot to say about anything, so I'll try to limit myself. Your question is great, actually, and ties in with a lot of other things that I've been working on. I don't want to become one of these tiresome people who just sort of talked about all their own projects, so maybe we can talk about that later. But I've got lots of projects going on, and some of them are indeed about individual identity construction as well as organization. What I wanted to do, when I was thinking about what to say and how to introduce this conversation, actually I started with a question that Caitlin asked me the other day, was about my influences. And so I thought, well, maybe it would be interesting to talk a little bit about how I come at these different aspects of tonight's conversation about narrative and identity and authenticity and social media, and use those as a starting point for discussion, since they're probably different from how other people approach these same ideas and concepts. So let's start a little bit, and it's hard for me actually to tease them apart, because I've been working on seeing them together for so long that I can't really separate narrative from identity, so it'll be a little bit blurry. But some of my major influences have been Walter Fisher and his notion of homo narrans, right? That we as humans are basically wired to think in terms of stories. That's how we make sense of the world around us. We tell stories to understand things, and we fit our experiences into stories to make sense of them. And on a similar, yet also very different note, Margaret Summers has done some work on narrativity, or what she calls ontological narrative, meaning that narrative is a way of being, right? So it's this relational process through which we make sense of the world, yes, but then expanding it into how we also make sense of our own identities, how we constitute our identities through a social storytelling or narrative process. And although not strictly related to identity, at least he wasn't writing about identity, rhetorician Michael Mcgee had sort of a post-structuralist approach to narrative, and saying that these narratives that we do create and in making sense of the world and our experiences are often constituted of little fragments, especially in relation to our mediated experiences, that we pull bits and pieces from the media to which we are exposed and incorporate those fragments into our general understanding of the world through narrative. So basically, I see identity as a social process and fundamentally a narrative process. And so this is a little different from definitions that you see about, that we see as essentialist, about what is most enduring about an organization or an individual. I actually see it as an ongoing process of construction. And this is the same perspective that I bring to my thoughts about authenticity when I first started looking at it. And I really see, as if you did have a chance to look at the article, authenticity is kind of an extension of identity that really just shifts the locus of construction from within the individual or the organization to external parties, because you can make a lot of deliberate or conscious decisions about how you're going to constitute your identity. I think a lot of it is unconscious and automatic, but you can't unilaterally decide, either as an individual or organization, that you are behaving authentically. Other people have to weigh in and evaluate their whether you are authentic or being authentic in their perception based on their interactions with you and their experiences with you as an individual. So that's the narrative, identity, authenticity part. Social media, where do those come in? I teach a class, we're actually in our second semester, a class on social media here at Arizona State University. Last semester I had 45 students, this semester I have 110. So it's actually a very different class. But what I designed it so that we could look at not just the applied dimensions of social media, which is often what I have seen and done in other kinds of classes, but really think about what we're talking about when we say social media and cultural and other impacts on them. And so of course I have to start with a definition. And this is my definition, which I'm still tweaking, but the state it's at right now is a two-parter. And the first part, well, it's the same in that I would say that they are mostly digital tools and practices used to publicly or semi-publicly, share user-generated multimedia content, and B, and which I think is the most important part, establish and maintain relationships. I think that's where the social part of social media come in. And this is an ongoing discussion I have, especially with people who come from old media backgrounds who often think more about the getting information out or maybe passing it on versus the dialogic aspect. So I think that's important. And if we do think about social media as relational, then that also maybe affects the way that we think about them and what we consider to be important. And I think with social media, especially viewed in this fashion, authenticity becomes a really important question, because there is at least a perception that online it's very easy to dissemble or deceive. People pretend to be something you're not, or brush things under the rug compared to other kinds of relational interactions. So, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the article that some of you might have glanced at, but basically the 4 dimensions that we came up with when we started researching authenticity and thinking about it. In this particular context, it was starting with a study of public institutions, specifically the State Department blog that was relatively new when we first started looking at it, about a year old, and trying to think about what are the dimensions that people might be evaluating in order to determine the relative authenticity, because obviously something like that could very easily be perceived as just a vehicle for propaganda. So if we were going to determine whether people saw it as being more authentic, what would they be looking for? And the 4 dimensions, which we put on continua, are authority. So basically, the perceived degree of legitimacy of a given institution or individual to express opinions about a certain context. You know, do they have any knowledge about it? Are they actually involved in this context? So the perceived degree of authority. Identity in the sense of whether it's perceived as more genuine or more performative. Transparency, so the degree of to which people feel that you're giving the entire truth. You know, you can be truthful but not saying the whole truth, right? So obstructive versus openness. And engagement also, the degree of interactivity. Obviously, with these 4 dimensions, it's kind of impossible for any institution that I can think of to be 100% authentic, because there are usually structural constraints that make it impossible for them to reach the highest levels on all of these 4 dimensions. But in thinking about it, I think one of the interesting ways of looking at it is really a model of control, or measure of control. The more that an organization in particular is, and I think potentially, to go back to the question, also maybe an individual, the extent to which a person is or individual or organization is seen as trying to control interactions and its image, the lesser the authenticity, the perceived authenticity. So you can almost say that authenticity is sort of related to spontaneity. And in social media context, one of the big pressures that organizations are facing is that people, the cultural changes that have come about through these technologies now available to us, is that people are engaged in what Henry Jenkins called participative culture, participatory culture. So we expect to engage in every aspect of it. We expect to have conversations with companies that we do business with our government institutions, with our fire department, with everything, and also very quickly. So this is a lot of pressure on organizations, many of which are not really structured this way. And I think that they often, because of the speed at which these exchanges are expected to happen, organizations that have a very centralized and hierarchical structure are going to be perceived as maybe less authentic. They'll be at a disadvantage, let's put it this way, in terms of authenticity compared to those that are willing to let various employees or members interact directly and in the moment with engage with stakeholders. Other thing is, it's really important, I think, to think about this model not as something that you can put a badge of authenticity like a USDA stamp on the beach, but it's very perceptual because it is an ongoing process of construction, and contextual. So it's never going to be an intrinsic characteristic, but it's very much based on a particular relationship or set of relationships at a particular time and in a particular place, be it a real or a virtual place. So some questions that I think maybe other people will want to discuss, but feel free to discard these and talk about completely other different things. I'm interested in thinking about boundaries, for one thing. So in order for any individual or entity or organization to exist, it has to have certain boundaries, right? So even if they are fuzzy and permeable, but we have to be able to say where one ends. Does authenticity, in this sense, does it play a role in determining where we set those boundaries and how they might shift over time? Second question is, can a strategic identity be authentic? As I said, most organizations have some kind of constraints on maybe the degree to which they can interact, what they can and cannot disclose. Does that mean that they are necessarily inauthentic? And this also applies to individuals who might have reasons for constructing a more strategic professional say identity. And finally, and this is something that I'm starting to work on now, is about privacy, and related to that, to both of those really, about privacy boundaries. So can authenticity coexist with privacy? I think in social media context, one of the big questions that we're running into at the individual level is trying to deal with this blurring of personal and professional identities and how much and what to disclose in which settings, and yet even if you are careful about what you put out in different places, there are ways that information can be aggregated. And so if you are trying to make some of these strategic decisions, can you maintain some semblance of privacy while still being authentic and not So those are some questions that I have for people, anybody who might want to talk about them. That's all I got. That's my starting.
That is fantastic. Thank you. And I'm going to invite John. Do you want to kick us off in terms of some comments, or anybody else too that would like to? So, and Dawn, let us know if you can hear everybody too. I just want to make sure of that.
So far, I've been able to hear everything great.
I guess just as a preliminary comment of mine, I too, as a communication person, have been influenced by Walter Fisher, among others, for understanding the concept of story, and that communication is basically a series of narratives, and that all communication is storytelling. So when I go home tonight and say to my wife, "How was your day?" she's going to tell me her story, just as I'm telling you my story now. And narration there's no other kind of communication. There's no instrumental or functional, it's all that. So I come from that same perspective. I think in reading Dawn's paper, I found it kind of interesting. I just have a student who, I was reading her master's thesis earlier in the day, and her master's thesis is entitled The Interpretation of Online Identity on Facebook and Social Networking Sites. And so I've been reading that for about the last 4.5 months, but I was reading again today, thinking, okay, it comes from a very different place than where Dawn's paper does, because Dawn's paper is about these public entities like the State Department or whatever this is, and it was so foreign to think that the State Department even wants a public identity. And as I read through there, yeah, the question of boundaries that you just raised is that very place, that they have no one person, so no one identity. And then what are the limits of a public and private self? And what, I mean, it's like I was using as an example today that we all must play these roles. And so if I go into the doctor and I'm very sick and very wounded, the doctor's not going to say to me, "Oh, yuck, I can't stand to look at you." The doctor's going to, role play being the doctor, and hopefully I'll be the patient, and he will or she will do what's necessary, and then go in the next room and say, "Oh, yuck, I couldn't stand the way that person looked." But they weren't going to do that as a public self, right? That was the public self to me was doctor, counselor, person taking care of me, doing the kind of things I need. So I think the questions you raise in terms of the public entity really around this concept of boundary kind of resonate with me, but I see that in our social sphere as well, that in our daily life, the boundaries are always there, and how would they possibly go away? So I'll come back to that question on authenticity in a bit, but that's where I think I'd start out with.
Why don't you open it up
Just
for...
if I can interject
Yep.
something. Last night I was speaking to a group of lawyers and judges locally who was very interesting because most of them are not at all on social media, and a lot of it has to do with this because they have such very strongly ingrained sense of boundaries, and they need to for professional reasons. And there was in fact an expert on ethics and legal ethics particularly who was explaining why, if you are on Facebook, it's probably not a good idea to friend your clients, because then they can write things. There have been already some cases where clients would write on the lawyer's wall, "Oh, great pictures from your vacation, and hey, I destroyed those documents."
Yeah.
So, it's a little bit complicated separating out. I just wanted to.
Yeah. Thank you. Whoever else would like to go next?
Maybe I'll follow up because it makes sense to me, I guess. That we have, so I have thesis students also, and so I'm reading a bunch of thesis papers, and maybe you have this experience in your 110 class of students on social media, but they want to study the relationship they have with organizations through social media, and I keep thinking, well, you know, I don't want to go to the bank and then I don't want to be friends with my bank, right? I don't want to go to the bank and then say, oh, let's go have coffee, bank. You know, like we're not friends. So but they keep at this question, and you said it too, that that because we have two-way interaction now, we're going to have relationships with organizations, which is interesting. And then as you think about as you talk about authenticity, I can't help but think about, we had a visiting scholar here a couple years ago, John Pauly from Marquette University, and his whole topic was how corporations imagine themselves as moral actors. And so I'm thinking, well, wouldn't the State Department or whatever, your bank or whatever corporation target that you want to have some kind of an interaction with or relationship with, wouldn't they have to first figure out how they imagine themselves in order to be authentic, right? I don't know how.
The identity part.
I know we create, or we're starting to treat corporations and organizations like individuals, but it seems like there's some work that has to be done there before I can interact that way, I guess. So
I guess because I come from a public relations background, the idea of a relationship between an organization, even though I agree, you know, there's no going out for coffee, but it seems natural to me because we do have a relationship. It's just a different kind of relationship. But now I would say that it is taking on a lot of the same characteristics. Whereas in the past, you always had a relationship with your bank.
Right.
In the sense of, to what extent did they trust you to, I don't know, pay off your mortgage and therefore, you know, give you a certain interest rate. You know, there's always relationships with institutions of various kinds, but now there's a more sort of personal,
interpersonal, right?
Interpersonal level of interaction that is being demanded, and that some institutions are better at than others. But I totally agree with you. A friend sent me a letter because she knew I would read it. Sent me a letter.
That sounds like a friend.
Yes, she sent me a letter from her insurance company in which they encouraged her to friend them on Facebook and something else because I don't know, I can't remember exactly, but they were trying to say that this way we can give you better information about your health. And I don't want to have that I don't want to have a chatty relationship with my insurer. I want them to insure me for stuff. That's pretty much all I want. But there is a lot of pressure on organizations to be friendly, and a lot of it I think is very badly done in the letter too. We're just so, I think, inauthentic. I guess that's what I'd say. Like, here we are, we're going to be buddies, as though we were going to go for coffee. And I think that trying to negotiate these different demands of how to be human and have interactions, actually respond to people on their level versus taking it too far, and it was clearly a bid to just try to up the numbers of friends, which is a whole other ridiculous conversation. it's true, relationships are changing.
Well, I'm taken by Lionel Trilling's distinction between sincerity and authenticity. And it seems to me that, well, I don't know. It seems to me that in this context of social media, perhaps that distinction is a distinction between self-disclosure and maybe self-exploration, where you're inviting the other person to help define you. So that sincerity would be about transparency and accountability, whereas authenticity might be about being responsive, that you're responding to what's being told to you. And I remember in your paper, you made one comment about how at least a lot of organizations don't want the clients to be negotiating the organization's identity, right? That they got their talking points, and that they do want to be strategic to a degree. So I'm not sure what it would mean for, I guess I'm a little confused about what it would mean for the State Department's Public Relations Department to be authentic. I guess it would mean it would be responding to questions, but it's not like we're going to change our foreign policy in light of comments on that people are contributing, or maybe it is, I don't know. But
and what you're talking about is what is usually in public relations theory called symmetry, right?
Okay.
That there's two-way symmetrical and two-way asymmetrical communication, and two-way asymmetrical communication would be inviting feedback, but without even pretending to place both interlocutors sort of on the same level, whereas two-way symmetrical dialogue would mean more of a negotiation, where you're really taking things in and both sides are at least trying to come to some sort of agreement that might require change on both sides. And I think that's true, and one of the challenges of an institution like the State Department, I think they could do a better job of engaging, even though part of the reason that they don't is because of their structural limitations, but they are definitely not crowdsourcing foreign policy through their blog, which would be more, at least not yet. I hope we don't get to that point, but.
Although we like to think that when we like to think that when we write our congressmen, that's actually going to shape their policy.
Mm-hmm. So is a letter to a congressman qualitatively different than a comment on, say, that congressman's blog or on the State Department blog?
Well, I'd like to go back to something Heather said, and then maybe tie this to something more personal kind of thing about this, maybe. I have a lot of theory stuff, and I'm not going to, I'll skip the theory, although I'll say a few names just to say, I start with Walter Ong, and from Walter Ong, I go into Walter Fisher, and from Walter Fisher, I go into Marshall McLuhan, and then I get down to Irving Goffman and presentation of self in everyday life, and how this self is displayed, how identity is formed, and how identity switches from public and private environments, and so on and so on. And then I talk about what identities consist of, and then I say, okay, so all this stuff about how I come to the perspective I have. But then I want to use an example, and it's so different because it goes back to Heather Crandall's idea about this organization having a self or an identity, or there's any such thing, or they're really open into sharing their identity, because really identities are co-created, co-constructed, so they're not part of the so they can't get there, or they don't choose to want to be there, as Tim was saying, or I don't want to have a relationship with somebody who doesn't have a self anyway. But that just leads me back to me, and what parts of myself do I want to make public, and to whom? And so 2 years ago, I was asked by Dr. Mike Carey to participate in this Second Life pilot project, okay? And for the pilot project, the first step was you had to create an avatar. And And then you had to give your name your avatar a name, and then you actually had to create what your avatar would look like, right? So there was a lot of steps in this picking of this avatar. So I named my avatar Bronze Bro Juicy, although some started calling me Bronze Bro Juicy. So then I made up a story that actually my last name is Juicy. It's a French name, but it's anglicized to Juicy. Now, I got this fiction thing going, right? My avatar had dreadlocks and very darkish skin, with a deep tan of summer, right? Was I being authentic? Was this my alter ego? Was this the persona I was negotiating and presenting to others? Was this actually closer to the self that I know than other people know about me? Who would I let know this self and, like the Wizard of Oz, roll back the curtain of everyday life to reveal it's just me? It's just me back here, but really on Second Life I can fly. I can play around. I got used clothes from Mike Carey, who sold me some of his clothes, you know, because he said you got kind of tattered goods there. And you say, this is pretty wild, pretty crazy stuff. But I think it was authentic. I don't think any part of that was inauthentic. Now, there's a danger that I let that Bronze Bro Juicy out in daily life. And any number of environments, they say, oh, John, you got to keep up the standards of academia, and Bronze Bro Juicy doesn't kind of get there, or, right? Because now I'm in professor role. I'm in teacher role. How much of me appears there? Hopefully I have an integrated self. That is, the self that's inside of Bronze Bro Juicy is also the self that's sitting here, and the self that goes home with my wife later tonight, that nobody doesn't recognize me in that other role. Like the first time, did you have this experience, first time you went to a grocery store as a child and saw one of your teachers buying groceries and you said, they shop, they eat, they do normal things. I did, I had that. And I think again, because I only saw him as the role and not the person, but the person does emerge unless the facade is so powerful, or the rules that are guiding our behavior are limiting our behavior to such extent. Or I'm such a, I used this in one of Joe's things last year using Catcher in the Rye, or I'm such a phony from Holden Caulfield and Catcher in the Rye, right? Or am I, so authenticity and phoniness, they have a place, but it's really role-playing, I think. And so when I'm online and when I'm doing Bronze Bro Juicy, or I'm just emailing a person, I think I'm always being authentic, although there's danger in being authentic, right? There's danger that somebody won't like the authentic, and so should I in fact play a different role? Should I be less authentic? Should I not let people know this part of me? And I'm hoping I'm making wise choices. So Facebook, for example, I certainly don't want some pictures of me in bars in Italy dancing with students on Facebook page, but I think, well, I do dance in bars in Italy and I do drink beer, but is it dangerous that so these are choices, but I think they're the choices we're always making all the time. And I don't think the technologies change that in any particular way, except there's more available to me to do that.
I think you're absolutely right. I would say though that in addition to there being more of it, there's the permanence of it and
right.
The number of people that are exposed to it. Because it's one thing if you are on it. When I was in Italy, I was doing my master's with the University of Memphis, and my advisor did a summer program in Lugano, taught at a summer program in Lugano, Switzerland. So I went up to Switzerland. I was very excited I could actually meet one of my professors right off the bat. And that night they had something going on, and I learned that he played the drums, and he was drumming, and we were out with a bunch of other students, other people with this program in Lugano, and they were drinking, and it was great. But it stayed there. It was, what happened when Lugano stayed in Lugano. Whereas now, it stays on Facebook and Flickr and YouTube and all of that, and Twitter and TwitPic, and sometimes it stays there forever and can be taken out of context. Because you could argue that what happens in that particular setting is contextually appropriate and fully authentic. But if it emerges in the middle of a lecture to some particular audience, that might not be appropriate. That's, I think, that one of the issues that comes up with social media.
Can I
So-
jump in and
okay.
ask Chris and Katie and Kirk to give a few opening comments before we go too far into the dialogue, even though that's like counterintuitive to the whole point of the meeting.
Oh, yeah, well, I'll pitch what I sort of prepared and maybe a little bit of this. So some things I thought of when you're talking about, what Juicy, what's the first name? Bronzeboro Juicy. I mean, I myself have tried to spend some time on Second Life. I find the interface difficult to get over, so I've been nothing but a tourist in Second Life, and I think this might be a good distinction to bring in. And if we're going to talk about the sort of notions of authenticity in social media, it seems to me on one level, one could be a tourist in social media and it's pure play. So it's kind of like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas sort of thing. So if one is going at and participating in social media in the sense of play, such that what happens in Second Life stays in Second Life, then the question of authenticity is impossible because they're not invested in the social exchanges going on. But now you obviously spent enough time on there to where you were socially invested in the identity you were creating through your actions in Second Life, such that it mattered, and so you come up with this narrative. So I think that's one distinction to make, is a lot of times in the social media, some people want to draw a strong distinction between their real selves and their virtual selves. And this is, I think, probably more and more becoming passé as we become more acquainted with it, so people don't do this that much anymore. But it seems that's one way to keep, one notion of this idea of, I mean, because you use this idea of facade, and then somebody's talking about how I represent myself online. I mean, if we're talking about authenticity, those just don't fit, right? I mean, it's not that the social role is a facade, it's that I'm manifesting my being in this role, right? And that's what freaks you out about the teacher, right. Is the teacher was just the role, but then when you realize, oh no, they're a ordinary person that has to eat, it's sort of this cognitive dissonance. But of course the teacher would have said, yes, I'm a teacher, but I also buy groceries, right? So the idea that the social role isn't a facade or somehow not us, it's the very site at which I enact my being, and these social roles are important because they're ways in which others understand who we are. And so when I think about when you go online, part of the problem, and you talk a little bit, you were talking about creating an avatar, which I think for people who are new to it, creating an avatar is a mini identity crisis. because the idea is if you really want to say not be a tourist, then what you're creating isn't a representation of you. It is the way in which you're going to manifest your being in this social environment. And another thing that throws things off, say in Second Life, is that the social mores are unclear to you beforehand. Mm-hmm. So, maybe... Sometimes yeah, and so, I mean, because it's international, so you don't really know what to expect. So this is where I think this analogy of being a tourist comes in again, is that when you're a tourist in a foreign country, part of the beauty of it is you don't understand most of the people, and they don't understand you, at least in the finer details of social interaction. So you kind of feel free in being in a foreign country because you don't understand the social cues and what their clothes mean, where when I walk down the street in Spokane, I'm making all sorts of judgments, I can't help it, about the people I'm passing, because that's the way we're constructed, it's socially. And so I think what I find in Second Life is there is a kind of freedom, and so having dreadlocks doesn't really matter, because one of the benefits of telepresence of online is you get rid of those things that are markers of identity, namely body and social status. And so you get to, in a sense, recreate them, and that's where the identity crisis comes in. But if you're serious about it, you'll be invested in that avatar in a way that I would imagine if you felt like Bronzeboro Juicy wasn't allow you to be who you were, you would have abandoned and started over, right? And this is what people do, where some people have a couple of different avatars. That strikes me as that's the kind of sense we have, and I have to admit, I just find it absolutely puzzling. But to think of it as not me as a representation or as a facade, I think already thinks that there's an inner me that expresses myself in the outward world. And if you're talking about authenticity, an expressive notion of the self, I think is less helpful than a notion that, no, I manifest myself in the world in these actions. And I manifest myself in the world in these actions in a social context. That's where the meaning is constructed. then there is no self, and this is what you guys have been saying, there is no self prior to the others acknowledging the meaning I'm giving to myself. And so I agree with everything that's said, but I just want to point out that to be clear, it's not an inner self that I can match with my outer self or not. It's that I manifest myself in my activities online or real life. And that's what I think is, I find if you're, I don't know how to say this, for many people who are sort of old-fashioned, that's hard to do. Because it seems so intentional. I'm creating my avatar, then this is play, this isn't serious. And so I think there are a lot of people that think Second Life is silly because it can't be serious. This is just gameplay. But anybody who spent time on Second Life says, no, it's not. This is real. And so that's what I think, and that's where your idea of this is. Of course, that was an authentic part of my
people
business.
say the same thing about Twitter, about Facebook.
Yeah.
You know, if you're not
Yeah.
familiar with the context and it seems alien to you for whatever reason, it's easy to dismiss it
Yeah.
as not real.
Yeah, and
even students, actually, I've had tons of students who despite all the kinds of digital natives, yes, they're on Facebook, most of them, a lot, but everything else they're nervous about
Yeah.
and distrustful of, and they're constantly bemoaning how online relationships are destroying face-to-face interaction, even though we've talked repeatedly about how actually research shows that people have active online social lives, have active offline social lives, and they are not an either-or. They're extensions of the same, but for many students, it's also difficult to really see that as real.
Yeah, and I think it's because it brings out the sense in which how, I mean, this would be Sartre, this would be my conceptual, where I'm drawing from, how my being for others is both me and not me, right? So there's the teacher in the grocery store, right? She's a teacher for you, and she can't control what you think of her. And so when we go online, we want to control what people think about us, so we actively construct this avatar, and then we have these interactions, but of course we can't. And I think that, to me, is the intuitively alienating. Of course, for Sartre, this is why, hell is other people, right? Is that I can never get that back, right? I don't know what Second Life would be for Sartre. It would be like a lower level of hell or something. But anyway, I'll stop there.
Katie and Chris?
Okay. Well, I've never used Second Life, unlike the gentleman next to me. But my most use in terms of Facebook, probably like everybody else in this room. But some of the things that I'm researching for a paper that I'm writing right now show that a lot of the people who use the internet have a very different personality profile than people who use Facebook. People who tend to use Facebook are a lot more extroverted than people who generally use the internet. It's usually narcissistic people who tend to use Facebook more, not in like a really negative way, just in terms of like they need like kind of a boost a lot of the time, are the people who spend excessive amounts of time on Facebook. But in terms of representation of self, Second Life, you're creating an avatar that reflects only the things that you want. If I wanted to be, super tan, blonde, blue-eyed, I can do that on Second Life, no problem. On Facebook, like, first of all, I wouldn't be able to do that because that's not me. But second of all, you're interacting with people who know you face to face. That's what Facebook's constructed for. Most students, I feel, won't accept friend requests or send out friend requests to people they don't know. Therefore, if I try to pose as somebody who doesn't look like me whatsoever, or who has different characteristics, somebody who's really into motorcycles, which is not at all me, people will call me out on that. Even if I once said I was into mountain biking, and my brother got on there the next day. No, you're not. Like, you're an awful mountain biker. Okay, that goes down. You can't pose as somebody that you're not. Not because of my actions, but because of other people. If I go to I don't know where you were with your professor, but if I go have a good time in Vegas, there has to be no cameras there. Otherwise, that will somehow make it to Facebook. Even if I untag myself, it's still up there. There's still people who have access to that, and therefore, Facebook as a medium is not a good way for one to present oneself as somebody that isn't who they really are. There's just too many ways for people to call you out on that, and too many variables. I mean, if you have more than 20 friends or however many people you actively interact with on a day-to-day basis, then somebody's gonna have some picture of you somewhere, and not in like a bad way, just in a way that you can't present yourself in a way that is inauthentic, I would say. At least on Facebook. I don't know about MySpace. MySpace has kind of gone under the carpet for a little bit. But Second Life, you can do that wholeheartedly because most of the people you, in fact, I'd say almost all of the people you meet on Second Life, you probably haven't met in real life and you probably don't want to meet in real life. So it's just a different type of person that spends a lot of time on Facebook versus a person who spends a lot of time on Second Life or all those other World of Warcraft type role-playing. No, Facebook isn't about role-playing.
I think it's really interesting that you raised that point because my current favorite book about privacy is by a legal scholar named Nissenbaum. It came out last year. It's about not social media specifically, but technology and privacy. And obviously, a lot of it is talking about different definitions of privacy. She's a legal scholar, so she likes lots of definitions. But and she, of course, she did a lot of research. And I can't remember whose conceptualization of privacy this was, but one that she raised was that privacy is actually a space in which one can feel safe to experiment with identity and construct an identity. To have that freedom. And one of the arguments about social media in relation to that definition of privacy is that it actually is sets bad limits because of social networking sites like Facebook and LinkedIn, and LinkedIn is more professional anyway, but sites where you don't have that same kind of freedom to experiment, which is arguably an important part of life. Experimenting with different aspects of your identity, and if you don't have a space in which you can do that, or if a lot of your interactions are online and you can't do that, then you could be in a truly private setting. You could be a great mountain biker.
Truly private.
In your private world.
Chris?
Well, I'm going to take the conversation back for a second because as a journalist, 13 years covering government and politics, I was really fascinated by many elements of your piece. And one of the things I was thinking about, I was wondering if after studying the State Department, which it seems almost, in a way, a blog almost seems contrary to the State Department in a way, because blog seems personal to me, and the blogs that I tend to follow or my students tend to follow are very personal. And you talk a lot in the piece about how one of the reasons the blog kind of struggled was this varying voices. And I was wondering if you had come across some government voices. Going back a second, one of the things I loved was the piece where you said that the people that seemed the most authentic tended to be the people who weren't the authority figure necessarily, which covering politics, I definitely felt that when I wanted something, I went to the person who was, the receptionist at the front desk as opposed to the mayor or the governor, because I got more authentic answers from that person. And I'm wondering, you talked about a UK site that did seem to have more authenticity, and I'm wondering if you've seen other sites since then, because I went on Diplog and I was looking around and and I noticed this, that recently that there was like an article on Clinton talking, like the two today that stuck out for me were one, Clinton talking at the Kennedy Center, and then another piece that was written in first person, but there was no consistency in the voice, which relates to that authenticity piece. And I'm wondering if you've seen some that are more authentic and how they go about doing that, because when I was looking at it, I saw it more as public relations as opposed to the blogs that have a voice that you follow because they give you insight into the inner workings of something. I didn't feel that when I was looking at it, and I wondered if you'd seen something.
And actually, I have not seen any institutional blogs that I would hold up as great examples of authenticity. And I actually think that the tenor of DipNote has changed radically.
I was wondering about that, actually.
Since we did this study. So here's a social media story. When I was researching this paper that we were working on in the project, I happened to mention on Twitter, just, as a little thing, I was working on a project about DipNote, or I'm not remember exactly if I named DipNote or just said the State Department blog or something. And I immediately, or very shortly thereafter, was followed by Sean McCormick, who was the State Department spokesman. And followed that, a little nervous, like, oops, did I say that? Am I going to be investigated by the State Department now? But no, actually, we started a conversation. He was the one who pushed to get this out because he wanted to have a place for the institution to be able to speak a little bit more directly rather than through more mass media, and to give voice to different parts of the organization. But there were some issues with commenting, etc. But we had a really interesting conversation, and when he left, when the administration changed, because he was under the Bush administration, and when the administration changed, he said, you know, I'm leaving, but he sent me a direct message saying, if you need any information, if I can help you in any way. I never called him on it, but it was a very nice offer. It's not somebody I would have just spontaneously written to on my own. So we became Twitter friends. But I think it's kind of curious, especially given you know, perceptions in terms of regimes or governments or party affiliations, that now, even though we have the most socially mediated government ever, with everything that's going on from the campaign on, that I think that Dipnote has become much less authentic.
Yes.
It would be interesting to go back and do a study again and analyze some of the things, because there are a lot fewer of those kind of new foreign service officer recounting minor mistakes, you know, or clumsiness on the job in their first, you know, being stationed in Poland and ordering the wrong thing, or, you know, little silly stories that are very human, and you know, yes, they avoid policy questions, but that's not what that's about. That's kind of more of the behind the scenes. It's more reality TV of State Department life. But now we get a lot less of that. I haven't looked at it a lot, but the times that I've gone back and sort of read a few, it does feel very strategic.
Very
and much
strategic.
much less authentic. And I think, I'm curious, I'd be curious to know, I have not been contacted by the current spokesperson, to find out, you know, if there's been some kind of a specific policy change or what. But it is a curious development. But I don't know, to answer your question, of any government institution blogs that are very authentic. And I think part of that is because of the constraints under which they operate, and how they are so cognizant of speaking to many, many different audiences at once, which is difficult. I mean, it's difficult for individuals. It's also difficult. It's difficult for Walmart. And it's just also difficult, I don't know why that one came up, but the company. And it's difficult for, even more so, I think, for government institutions. That was pretty great.
Yeah.
When we start that low.
Yeah.
But isn't a mark of authenticity, or an indicator of authenticity, kind of a sign of vulnerability, of saying embarrassing things that don't actually need to be said, but the fact that you're volunteering them makes it sound authentic. So again, why would an institution ever do that? Except maybe for a strategic purpose behind the vulnerable.
Oh, you're so cynical.
Well, I'm just wondering. I mean, like the State Department. I mean, WikiLeaks, right? That exposed all kinds of
authenticity.
Well, yeah, and if the State Department had released those, I guess we would call them very authentic, right?
We would probably call most of them fired.
Well, exactly. Yeah. So, what would be?
So why would an organization do that? Well, I think we're back to the fact that now there is a demand. People want to have interaction. We have different changing cultural expectations, I think, of our institutions at every level, from the pizzeria to the supermarket chain to our civic institutions. And I think that we as a populace are increasingly demanding ways to know what's going on behind the scenes, and a way to interact with them in public. So not just writing the letter, because not everybody can see the letter. But if I tweet at the State Department, other people will see that exchange, if they answer me back and see it, and it can become important for both of us to do that. So I think that it's more a sign of bowing to cultural pressures,
and
aside from whatever strategic thoughts they might have.
And is that a compensation for kind of the size and impersonality of institutions, that we want them to be more personal?
We want everything to be personal now. Everything is custom. Everything is niche. We are the long tail, you know? So we want that kind of specificity, I think, from our interactions with lots of different kinds of entities that wouldn't have really been on the radar for most of us a few years ago.
I want to jump in now and just enlarge the discussion a little bit and invite audience members to, and panelists as well, to continue. But I want to open it up for the next little bit to folks that are joining us tonight with questions for the panelists or just comments you might want to offer. So.
And I also wanted to specifically, not to pick on you, but there's this professor visiting from North Carolina State University, Prestigious Communications, and who want to jump in. I just would love to ask them.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'll just speak briefly. I'm on East Coast time, so I'm doing really well right now. But I think I'm going to jump in and say that I agree with the whole, I think what I do as a teacher is I create and perpetuate stories that I hope my students will buy into, disciplinary stories. And so the narrative view on teaching really fits with the way I think about it. And I think anymore I cannot ignore social media as I think about creating and perpetuating those stories that I hope my students will buy into. And it is because I believe social media changes the narratives that my students bring to the classroom, qualitatively, fundamentally and qualitatively, right? And it changes my students' conceptions of an authentic teaching and learning moment, fundamentally and qualitatively. And so I think we need to ask all the same questions that have come up here tonight of our classrooms. How does social media change the teacher-student relationship? How does social media change our conception of collaboration? My students have a very different definition of collaboration than I do. And a lot of that has to do with social media. And specifically, how do you create an authentic teaching and learning moment? What does that mean? And what does that mean in light of social media? So those are the questions I'm playing with. My expertise is in teaching and learning, not necessarily in social media. But I think as teachers and as scholars, we need to be asking those questions, the same questions that have come up today: privacy, control, authenticity, authority of our classrooms.
Well, that's pretty good for these folks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm also going to invite Dr. Mike Carey. Mike is the acting dean of School of Professional Studies. You're one of the sponsors, actually, of tonight's event, and a leader in introducing technology here on campus. So, Mike, your thoughts?
Well, you know, I was just thinking, given Bronzebow's comments, you know, I guess I see all of this on a continuum. So, you know, one person creating an identity on Second Life is on one end of the continuum. What we're doing in this room right now, by the way we dressed and by how we speak with each other and how, you know, we interact with each other is on the other end of that continuum, but they're all self-presentations of identity. Which is more authentic? I mean, are we being authentic in this room just because we're face to face? I'm not so sure. So what I find fascinating about the Second Life environment is it allows you, and I think you did that well, John, is you get to ask some of these questions that have applications in real life.
By the way, what you're seeing on the screen is not me, it's my avatar.
You know, go back to Second Life for just a minute, and all these other social media as well, but the interesting thing about Second Life, and it isn't like, I may be a tourist on Second Life, but what Mike was trying to do on Second Life, and this was in that, I don't know if you saw that PBS video, Growing Up Digital, and they were using workers at IBM in Poughkeepsie who no longer go into the office. Everything is done online, and they only go there very occasionally, go in this big, almost like mausoleum of an office building these days, because there's not much going on there. But they're saying that the people who are telecommuting in are much nicer to each other than they were when they were really in the building in the same place. That the playfulness, maybe, of using technology to do this made them more relaxed about their colleagues. And the interesting thing for me was what Dr. Carey was trying to do with us on Second Life is he wanted to have a very serious dialogue. He wanted to try to bring us back to Spain and a dialogue between Muslims, Jews, and Christians, that if we could have that dialogue on Second Life, maybe we'd be free enough to sort of bring that into First Life in some way, to regain something that got crushed and tampered with. But Second Life would allow people from all over the world to have this anonymity and avatar, but allow them to carry on that very important conversation. And maybe you should say one or two things about your hopes and what, it's not there, but that's where you're getting us to, right?
Yeah, and I think it does have to do with the narrative. In other
Right.
words, people would be able to tell their story, but they could create that story without some of the constraints or the boundaries that they might have if they were having that conversation in their own city, in their own real place. They could come there, they could create an identity, they could talk with each other in a way that perhaps they couldn't talk in real life. And that story that was created there could inform or could change the story that they are living out in their own environment, the real life environment.
So to that extent, when Katie brought up, well, no, on Facebook you can't do that because somebody's going to call you out. That's not really you. You're not a mountain biker or whatever. That thing. It is true. It's a very different kind of place. I do use Facebook, and I probably use it more than Second Life, actually. But I don't really try. I don't know. It is such a different place. What am I posting on Facebook? I'm responding to what people are asking or saying, or they're giving me a menu, a recipe, or I just came from the Elton John concert, and well, oh yeah, you must have had fun, Or well, so it's. I guess maybe we should not even lump all these social media together because they serve such different purposes. As a tool that we acquire and use. And when John Pauley was here a few years ago that Heather mentioned, he said he didn't have a place on Facebook. He said he thinks that it looks kind of awful when older men are lurking out there on Facebook. And I thought, uh-oh, I'm on Facebook. I could be lurking. I didn't. Better be careful with that.
I have a question. I'm having this crazy breakdown in my head right now because all my frameworks are crumbling. When you were talking about Facebook, Katie, and about mountain bikes, I was wondering if authenticity is ever possible retrospectively, because even if our Facebook accounts are somewhat representational of experiences we've had or pictures or whatever, we do have some sort of say in what goes up. And what we like, and how we I like this music because I like this boy, and I know he likes this music, so I'm going to say that I like this music too. And so all of the stuff on our Facebook accounts are in some way selected by ourselves that we put up there. And I think that can be said for many Facebook, or many social media medias. And so I'm wondering if our stories are not representations of reality, but are necessary fabrications by which we come to understand ourselves, then how, not that that's a bad thing, but just because we do make sense of our lives through narrative, then how is it ever possible that those narratives are authentic? I do believe that we can be authentic in the present and that we can strive towards authenticity. But I'm just wondering if, I just kind of crazy because I've always thought that they were so connected, and now I'm struggling with how they are.
I mean, is your question, it's one thing to ask the question, who am I? It's another thing to ask the question, who was I? And you want to say that the who was I question is always going to be a sort of infinite regress of this and that, and I can never come to a conclusion, whereas where am I, at least there's hope.
Was I informed? That's the whole point of Jill's class, is that
Sure.
who was I, and the turning points in our lives
Right.
inform so much of who we are and who we are to become.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think they're distinct. I mean, the who was I is clearly part of who am I. Right? And maybe that's the dilemma, is to separate distinctly who was I from who am I will create a kind of fracture that is artificial. Right? That the person I am is, I'm just sort of the tip of the becoming of the person that I am, in a sense, right? So that my history is who I am, in a way.
I'm just wondering how good, if we're so good at fooling others by creating, if I take my Facebook profile picture this way, it makes me look that much better. So if we're so good at fooling others as to who we are, then is that process fooling ourselves?
Are we really that good at fooling others? Things depend. I think that's one reason why engagement is such an important part of the authenticity aspect, because if you're only showing up every once in a while and posting a picture or something, then sure, you can present fairly easily a false persona, inauthentic persona. But if you are engaging regularly through various media, etc., and I think that's a lot harder to maintain. So I don't know that we're really good at fooling.
Well, sorry if I may. The times that we're sharing information on, the social media, Facebook, MySpace, or whatever, we're not necessarily doing it, even if we're doing it all the time, we're not doing it during every activity. I'm not gonna, update my status about studying. Like, even if I'm doing that 23 hours of the day, I'm not gonna talk about that. I'm gonna talk about the 1 hour I went to, a party or a concert or something. That's how I'm presented. There's never pictures of me, in my room studying. Like, that's what I'm doing a lot of the time, but at the same time, that's never the information that's going to be shared. So even though, you're still being authentic, you're still only being presented during the times that you are at your most, I'd say, socially active.
Well, but I don't know that that's the case for everyone, because I can tell you that my students frequently tweet about things that they are studying, not just for my class, but things that they do for other classes. Sometimes they use it sort of as a way to mentally check off. I don't do Facebook with my friends. I have with my students. I have a limit. But Twitter, which is public, I feel a lot more comfortable with. And they are often tweeting about things that they do related. So sometimes they'll just check off to-do list items and just say, okay, got this done, now I have to do this other thing. It's not the most fascinating reading, but it's out there, and it's something that they are using to construct their identity. So,
That's good as a question.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's true that it's all social.
It seems to me that a lot of the discussion of what's built up has been around authenticity, so that's what I'm going to address primarily. I don't understand how it can't come down to being congruent. If we're going to have this symmetrical relationship, as Mother talked about and she was talking about, I just don't understand how it can't come down to what we perceive as what our intentions are versus what is happening. This addresses the question of who we are and who we were. I think this is where announcing or having some intentions of what we're planning to do and why we're planning to do it, expressing the motivations, and then having the other people, the people out on Facebook or your friends or something, give you feedback as to what was done, so you're provided a different perspective as to what actually happened, who I actually was, is the symmetrical part of it, because all of this, to me, is very much judgmental from an outside perspective. If we look at it from a congruency standpoint, what are our intentions? If our intentions are to post a blonde, blue-haired girl as your profile or whatever, why are you doing that? Is it your ego? Is it the fear of not being accepted? If it is that, if that is your driving motivation, your intentions are to post that because you have that fear and you authentically, you genuinely, however you want to term that, have that fear, you are being congruent with your intentions of why you're doing it. So how is that inauthentic? How is that for someone to judge someone else as being inauthentic when you're being true to yourself? To me, that's a lot of judgment around that. And then the other part, I don't understand the control piece. I'm going off of Ryan and Williams' self-determination theory, which deals with autonomy. We really feel a need to have autonomy, not just independence, but dependence on other things. We have a choice, we have some control, and we feel fearful or whatever when we don't have that sense of control. So then if we boil it down to one theory of living, how can we say that control is a source of being inauthentic when it's a source of we could say human nature or something like that? So I'm just not understanding, and these are maybe a little off topic, I don't know, but I'm just kind of curious as to your thoughts. To me, it's congruency of what we're doing and that we have to have a sense of control, and that's inherent in authenticity.
I'm going to let the panelists respond real quick. I just want to say that our system is kind of broken down here. So, Don, we love looking at you, but it looks like we're just going to be listening to you from now on. And the picture you have in front of you can't be changed either. So we're kind of locked in.
Magic.
It just took the magic words to say.
Yes, perfect, fantastic. So whoever would like to respond, great question.
Well, maybe the way to think about it is, it sounds like, if I understand you right, so that you're going back to this comment earlier that if I try to control too much the way others perceive me, then I'm being inauthentic or something like that, right? And that I can, that the person I am for others has to be congruent with who I, in a sense, it has to be congruent with who I really am, not who I think I am. I take it is that the congruency you're talking about?
Well, it's a congruency of questioning your intentions of what you're doing it and why you're doing it, and then other people provide the feedback or the symmetry.
I mean, in a sense, the thing here, the idea of identity is always acted out in a social context in which the meaning can't be just what I say it is. It has to be a social meaning. So if I'm somebody who has an identity on, say, Facebook, where I say that I'm somebody that objectively I'm not. I mean, in a sense, the social meaning of that is that I'm somebody who doesn't represent themselves who they really are on Facebook, right? And I'm not sure what would that mean in Facebook if you came across a Facebook. I don't do Facebook, so I don't know what it would mean. But it seems that the congruency isn't I'm not who I say I am. It's that I've made the statement in this public arena that I am not who I say I am, and maybe that is in itself a meaningful act. Does that make sense? So I mean, I have a student who thinks Facebook is silly, so he's invented a fake Facebook page that only his friends know, and he sort of makes fun of Facebook on Facebook, or what people do on Facebook. So that presence in that social media is already congruent with who he is, because the statement he wants to make is that I find Facebook silly. Does that make sense?
It's like Lady Gaga. I mean, Lady Gaga clearly is very performative in her public identity, but I wouldn't call her inauthentic.
Yeah.
Because she is using these very outlandish modes of dress and everything that she does in her songs to present and sometimes highlight some inconsistencies in our everyday social interactions, or the way our expectations of media figures or entertainment figures and so on. But I think, as I said, the authenticity is highly contextual. So you can't take it as a given that simply using a different name, for example, is going to be perceived as inauthentic. It depends on the context, and it depends on the set of relationships in which it takes place, as well as the space. So, for example, in the idea of Second Life, I met before, there's nothing at all inauthentic about having dreadlocks and wearing a sharkskin suit and presenting yourself in these different ways, because of the context and because of the relationships that you're building and the other dimensions that go. I think that the control question is really one about power. I think that if you start from the idea of self-determination, there is this idea, as you were just explaining, that we have ultimately the power to constitute our presence in the world, and I personally don't agree with that. I really do think that we have control over some aspects of what name we use and how we dress and all that, but we cannot control how other people perceive us. And the notion of identity and authenticity that we're looking at, that we've been discussing, is this social negotiated idea that we cannot control. And trying to force it in a particular way is seen as trying to dominate or exercise power in ways that are often not appreciated, again, depending on context.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. It's more I just don't understand then from that standpoint. I understand the power aspect, but then how is it inauthentic for a Department of Health or something like that to have a Facebook and they're providing information, maybe resources or something to the public, when that's what their job is to do? That's
are you talking about the letter from my friend that I mentioned earlier?
Well, just the bank or
I don't
any.
think there's anything inauthentic about what you just said. I think that's perfectly authentic. That is what they do. And I think it makes sense for institutions, even an insurance company, to, I mean, as a communicator, I think that you do need to go where your stakeholders want to find their information. I mean, if most of my members or customers or whatever are on Facebook and that's how they like to receive the information, then I think that is a way to provide it. I think that trying to push them into creating a friend-type relationship and use the letter as a way of specifically trying to drive up numbers of likes on Facebook, so achieve what I would consider to be an artificial measure of social capital, I think that is inauthentic. But the fact of putting information in places where people will find it useful, I think that's inauthentic.
Last point is just that I feel that if that was their intention, was to get up the numbers and things like that and do that, then they were being authentic. And that it's our judgment
I see.
that they are being
inauthentic,
but they're being authentic. It's our judgment of them and what they're doing that they're being authentic, and that it ultimately comes down to a judgment of the outside versus
that's true. And again, it is. I do think that, I am working from a definition of authenticity that is in fact determined by the outside, and that depends not only on someone being coherent with their plan, which is very strategic, but also being willing to engage and to be fully transparent about their motives, etc. So the model of authenticity that I'm using would require them not just to set themselves a goal and follow through with it, but to do so in a way that opens themselves up, as somebody said earlier, making themselves vulnerable, which I think is, in fact, a big part of it.
I hate to do this. The irony of this is that we need to conclude our session, and we're actually going to have a storytelling event following this. We've got about 40 people waiting out in the hall to come in. And the fun of it is, people are here to tell identity stories, and so it's really a fun experience, actually. But we put these back to back, and I think it's worked out fine. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, especially Dr. Gilpin. Thank you, Dawn, so much for being a part of this. It's been our pleasure having you here. For the panelists, from Tim and Kurt, Katie, John, Heather, and Chris, thanks all of you for taking the time to join us, and for Caitlin for organizing the whole thing. We'll be having more roundtables beginning in the fall, and we hope you'll want to participate in the future as well. But for now, thank you, and you're all welcome to stay, those of you who would like to, for the Story Slam, which is coming up in just a few minutes. So thank you. Good night, John.
Thank you.
Bye.